Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. In this episode of Philosophers Explained by me, Stephen Hicks, we turn to Francis Bacon's 1620 The Great Instauration, including the Novum Organum, perhaps the foundational text in modern philosophy and science. Let's go to the text. The Great Instauration, a word about the title. Instauration is closely related to the concept of restoration, taking something back to its original condition, the idea being that it's been abused or fallen into disrepair, a shadow of its former self in some respect, and so we want to go back and fix things and start over. Now, in one of the prefaces to this work, it's a multi-part work, and we're going to explore the openings and the famous Novum Organum, or the New Organon, the second book in this episode of Philosophers Explained. In this initial preface, Bacon speaks of himself as if he's in the third person, or speaks to himself in the third person, indicating his themes here. Francis of Verulam reasoned thus with himself, and then we go to the text. Being convinced that the human intellect makes its own difficulties, not using the true helps which are at man's disposal soberly and judiciously, whence follows manifold ignorance of things, and by reason of that ignorance, mischiefs innumerable. He thought all trial should be made, whether that commerce between the mind of man and the nature of things, which is more precious than anything on earth, or at least anything that is of the earth, might by any means be restored to its perfect and original condition, or if that may not be, yet reduced to a better condition than that in which it now is. All right, so the idea here is that we are inheriting a lot of traditions and a lot of ideas, and each of us as individuals has built up a store of knowledge and beliefs and so on, but there is a significant amount of ignorance still around us and built into what we have come to believe. And then when we try to act on the basis of that, mischiefs follow. At the same time, another interesting theme here is a value statement. What is the most important thing? The connection between one's mind and nature, the nature of the mind of man and the nature of things. More precious than anything. Now, let's get to this issue of the errors. We're now in the 1600s. Obviously, human beings have been around and thinking and coming up with belief systems for a long time. What has gone wrong? And Bacon emphasizes that wrongness. Now that the errors which have hitherto prevailed, how did they come about? Because the primary notions of things which the mind readily and passively imbibes, stores up, and accumulates, and it is from them that all the rest flow, are false, confused, and over hastily abstracted from the facts. So the operative concepts here are that we are absorbing things, but we are doing so passively. So a kind of passive-mindedness had been one of the problems of human beings up to this time. And having passively absorbed various things, readily accepting them and acting on the basis of it. So the implication then is that we need to be more active-minded and more critical from the get-go. As a result of many centuries of doing so, collectively or individually, many years of doing so, quote again, the entire fabric of human reason which we employ in the inquisition of nature is badly put together and built up, and like some magnificent structure without any foundation. So, as a result, Bacon then is announcing his ambition. There was but one course left, therefore, to try the whole thing anew, upon a better plan, and to commence a total reconstruction of the sciences, arts, and all human knowledge, raised on the proper foundations. And this great ambition, combined with the initial suspicion and skepticism about what has come down to us, is one of the things that marks Bacon as a founder of modern philosophy and modern science, rather than a reverence for tradition or some idea that all of the great truths or the important truths have already been discovered and it's our job to accept that tradition and pass it on to the next generation. That is a mark of someone who is pre-modern, and Bacon is marking a major break from that attitude. Plus, the soaring ambition, we're going to do a total reconstruction and rebuild anew from the foundations. Now, this might sound overly ambitious, perhaps hubristic, or too much for us to try to undertake, and Bacon is aware this, though in the project and undertaking it may seem a thing infinite and beyond all the powers of man, yet when it comes to be dealt with, it will be found sound and sober. All right, so aware of this great vaulting ambition, but having a confidence that if we put our minds to it, so to speak, we can pull off this job. Now, he has a dedication to King James, and what he suggests in here is a more personal note. Of course, it's dedicated to King James, but he's really speaking to all of us. And again, he speaks of his own role as a philosopher here in more modest terms now. I am wont, for my own part, to regard this work as a child of time rather than of wit. The only wonder being that the first notion of the thing, and such great suspicions concerning matters long established. So it come down from time, but I am like a child who has stepped into the flow of time, and what I have is a suspicion of what is being handed to me. I'm not going to be a credulous child who just believes whatever other people who are telling me. My goal is to kindle this new light in the darkness of philosophy. Not impressed with the state of philosophy of his time, perhaps more heat than light, and a lot more smoke than actual fire. The kindling of a new light in the darkness of philosophy. It's a very broad statement about what has been achieved by the philosophers. But then a recommendation to King James as an individual, speaking to him about how he should conduct himself in his own mind, giving advice here to the king, again, an ambitious thing to do. But what he wants the king, and by extension all of us who are his readers, to do is to follow his example, that is to say, his being Bacon's example, in taking order for the collecting and perfecting of a natural and experimental history. Pausing there for a moment. We're studying nature. We're going to do a natural history, and it is going to be experimental, involving some active interrogating of nature and taking nature apart and putting it together in various ways and so forth. So, true and severe, unencumbered with literature and book learning. Interesting parenthetical remark there. Don't expect to find wisdom and learning in books. They may in fact be an obstacle more. Go to nature. Look at nature through your own eyes. Do the experiments for yourself. On the basis of that, philosophy, or such as philosophy, may be built. And what we're looking for then is a foundation in the observation and experimentation upon nature, not just reading books and regurgitating what's in the books. So philosophy then, the sciences, may no longer float in air, but rest on the solid foundation of experience of every kind. Now, the floating in air metaphor is abstract, general ideas, often speculative in nature, that are taken for granted, and we just think in terms of those, or we try to reason from those, but our reasoning based on those floating abstractions, so to speak, is not necessarily going to actually take us back to reality. So, indications then of the new, the experimental, the observational, distrust of the old and the traditional. Now, another preface. That the state of knowledge is not prosperous nor greatly advancing, and that a way must be opened for the human understanding entirely different from any hitherto known. So he takes it as a fault that we are not actually making much by way of advancement, that we are in a stagnant place, or perhaps even in a declining place. So against those who are perhaps tempted to skepticism and saying, well, human beings have been thinking about stuff for a long time. Maybe the questions are too hard or they're too difficult, and stagnation is just the way things are meant to be. Bacon is much more ambitious, much more optimistic, that we should be able to, if we use our minds correctly, make advancements. And that will be the mark that we are on the right path. It seems to me that men do not rightly understand either their store or their strength, but overrate the one and underrate the other. Their store in this case is the storehouse of knowledge or the storehouse of beliefs that have come down to us. We overestimate those, and we underestimate our own strength as individuals, the strength of our minds potentially. We might say, well, what's come down to us from other people has come down from wise people, the wisdom of the ages and so forth. And then we combine that with, well, who am I to judge for myself? And what Bacon wants to argue is the opposite of those, that you are a potentially powerful thinker if you learn to use your mind correctly. And for various reasons, all kinds of ridiculous things and superstitions and unfounded things have come down through the ages. So don't overestimate the one and underestimate the other. The excess of honor and admiration with which our existing stock of inventions is regarded. Okay, so taking on this notion that we should revere the traditional books and the storehouse of wisdom that has come down to us. And Bacon says, well, if in fact you read a lot of these books, what do you find? For let a man look carefully into all that variety of books with which the arts and sciences abound. He will find everywhere endless repetitions of the same thing. So everybody quotes the Bible, everybody quotes Plato, everybody quotes Aristotle or Cicero or whomever, and they're not thinking for themselves, they're not developing new knowledge. It's just a few great works that are just endlessly being regurgitated. That's not advancement. Also, even though in many cases those early thinkers might have been on to something good, he has a fruitful metaphor here. As for its value and utility, it must be plainly avowed that that wisdom, which we have derived principally from the Greeks, is but like the boyhood of knowledge, and has the characteristic property of boys. It can talk, but it cannot generate, for it is fruitful of controversies, but barren of works. And so we have a kind of a biological metaphor. It may be that boyhood is a wonderful stage in human life, but we need to go through puberty. We need to become men, right, who can actually inseminate and generate new life, and by analogy, create new knowledge, just as boys often do, just regurgitate whatever their parents and their teachers are telling them without the wisdom of maturity. All right, so again, an ambition that we need to grow up, so to speak, intellectually. Now, he makes an interesting contrast here, and it's an instructive contrast. He says, in some areas of life, we are, in fact, making progress and advancements. In the mechanical arts, we do not find it so. They are, on the contrary, as having in them some breath of life, are continually growing and becoming more perfect. So machines and tools and so forth, in those areas where we're working with our hands and developing inventions and so on, there is a lot of progress that is going on. And that's an interesting and instructive contrast. As originally invented, they are commonly rude, clumsy, and shapeless. Afterwards, they acquire new powers and more commodious arrangements and constructions. So what's going on there? Well, we can anticipate a little bit. People are working with their hands. They're actually trying to get stuff done. They are interacting with nature, with the natural world. They are experimenting a lot, and they are actively trying to improve. as a result what's going on there. Can we adapt that method that is used widely in the mechanical arts to the intellectual arts? If we can, let's do it, but let's also figure out why we're not doing that. What has led us to think of our minds in a certain way and how we're supposed to use them that has prevented us from doing what people in the mechanical arts do. So the contrast here then is to philosophy and the high intellectual arts, and the intellectual sciences, on the contrary, stand like statues, worshipped and celebrated, but not moved or advanced. Nay, they sometimes flourish in the hands of the first author, and afterwards degenerate. For when men have once made over their judgments to others' keeping, and have agreed to support some one person's opinion, from that time they make no enlargement of the sciences themselves, but fall to the servile office of embellishing certain individual authors and increasing their retinue. So often what we do is we treat the great figures in earlier philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, whoever, as statues, as fixed. Plato said this. Who am I to challenge that? I receive that. I accept it as a dogma. I surrender my intellect and my active thinking. Who am I to criticize Plato, for goodness sake? And then simply become a part of his retinue, someone who just passes on the Platonic doctrine. So we need to be doing the opposite of that. Yes, we might learn some things from Plato and Aristotle and the others, but we should take them as suggestions, think through them for ourselves, be willing to criticize, be willing to try new things, and become the next Plato and Aristotle if that ambition is possible to it. Let it not be said that the sciences have been growing gradually till they have at last reached their full stature. That is to say, don't believe that we've somehow figured out all of the important truths and there's nothing more to be discovered. And so, having settled in the works of a few writers, that there being now no room for the invention of better. That's a trap. Don't fall into it. 4. First, we are far from knowing all that in the matter of sciences and arts has in various ages and places been brought to light and published. Even if we wanted to say that everything has already been thought and discovered and invented, right, and so forth, we do have to recognize that we have lost a significant amount of stuff in the past, and all we have is a small fraction of what remains. And so that would mean, at a minimum, that we need to rediscover and reinvent all of the stuff that has been lost. Also, though, this notion of deferring to things and ideas and works just because they have been around for a long time. We have to ask, well, why have they been around for a long time? And it's not obvious because they are true and perfect, or that's the only explanation. Nor, secondly, is the consent itself and the time it has continued a consideration of much worth. Now, why? The doctrines which find the most favor with the populace are those which are either contentious or pugnacious or specious and empty. So the vast majority of people, what do they like? Do they like really deep, hard truth and wisdom? No, they're going to be attracted to that which is superficial. They like a good fight. They like a good show. Or something that's sparkly, right, and so forth. So those are the things from the past that are going to grab the attentions of most people and therefore passed on to the next generation. And so, the fact that it's come down to us and it's got this long lineage, that doesn't really amount to very much. Time, then, is like a river which has brought down to us things light and puffed up, while those which are weighty and solid have sunk. There is none who has dwelt upon experience and the facts of nature as long as is necessary. Another criticism of the philosophies that have come down to us. They have been speculative, they have not been experimental, they have not been based on widespread observation. That is to say, none of the ancients. Now, there might be some exceptions that we can argue about, but there's none who has dwelt upon experience and the facts of nature as long as is necessary. They did some boyhood investigations. Now we need to be mature men as philosophers and scientists doing the serious work. Now the word logic is going to be an important concept here. The important second book in this great instauration, the Novum Organon, or the Organum, or the New Organon. The term there is organ, which is a tool, right? A functional tool for getting stuff done. And Aristotle, the great ancient, who is often seen as the father or the first systematizer of logic, wrote a series of short treatises on logic that collectively are typically called the Organon. And so what we want to do is ask what kind of organon, right, or what kind of organ or what kind of tool or what kind of logic did Aristotle develop, as brilliant as he was, and what are its limitations. As for those who have given the first place to logic, supposing that the surest helps to the sciences were to be found in that, they have indeed most truly and excellently perceived that the human intellect left to its own course is not to be trusted. And so that's why we need to develop logic and tools and explicit principles of methodology and methods that we use and check and double check in our thinking, and not just let our minds go wherever our minds want to go. But there's a problem here. The logic which is received, the logic that has come down to us since Aristotle, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance and the early modernity, as we now call it, that Bacon himself is living in, the logic that has come down to us, which is received, is not nearly subtle enough to deal with nature. Now, that's a strong claim. That is to say, then after 1,620 years plus 350 or so years, that's almost 2 millennia. All of the work that has been done on logic is not yet enough. It's not yet subtle enough. We need a new logic, a new and improved logic, or perhaps both a new logic and improvements on the existing logic. Now let's drill down into this a little more. Our steps must be guided by a clue, and the whole way from the very first perception of the senses must be laid out upon a sure plan. Now, the very first perception of the senses, this then is to say Bacon is an empiricist. We are going to start with the senses and our understanding of proper epistemology or proper methodology in philosophy and the sciences. The plan that we are going to develop will start from the first perception of the senses. But it's not going to be a naive empiricism, as we will go on to argue. Not that I would be understood to mean that nothing whatever has been done in so many ages by so great labors. Okay, fine, people have done hard work and a lot has been accomplished. No doubt the ancients proved themselves in everything that turns on wit and abstract meditation. Wonderful men. But as in former ages, when men sailed only by observation of the stars, they could indeed coast along the shores of the old continent or cross a few small and Mediterranean seas. So then we're developing here a navigation on water analogy. Yes, there have been great boat buildings that have gone on, great acts of seamanship that have been gone, and great journeys that have been gone on by men of daring and ambition. But because they didn't have the right tools, they were only able to do so in limited ways, to stick close to the shore, so to speak. But before the ocean could be traversed and the new world discovered, think Christopher Columbus, that's now 128 years prior to this writing by Bacon, so we're a century and a bit in the post-Columbus era. Before the ocean could be traversed and the new world discovered, the use of the mariner's needle as a more faithful and certain guide had to be found out. That is to say, a certain tool, a certain organ, a certain technology had to be invented to aid the sailors. In like manner, the discoveries which have hitherto been made in the arts and sciences are such as might be made by practice, etc., etc. Before we can reach the remoter and more hidden parts of nature, it is necessary that a more perfect use and application of the human mind and intellect be introduced. So just as sailors and navigators need to have certain tools developed in order to be able to go farther, we on the intellectual matters need to develop certain intellectual tools in order to be able to think farther and so forth. For all those who before me have applied themselves to the invention of arts have but cast a glance or two upon facts and examples. Another criticism here is not only that they don't have the right tools, but that they have not been empiricist systematically enough. So even those that are of a more empirical temperament, interested in nature, interested in the facts, and then generalizing from them, they've been too hasty. They've looked at a few facts, maybe done an experiment or two here, and then flown to great big generalizations. And so Bacon's point is going to be slow down and dwell upon the facts, dwell upon the observations, and do a lot more of them more carefully, not just a glance or two. I, on the contrary, dwelling purely and constantly among the facts of nature, withdraw my intellect from them no further than may suffice to let the images and rays of natural objects meet at a point as they do in the sense of vision. So the invitation here is for all of us to use our eyes, use our ears, use our other senses for a long time and then withdraw from them. That is to say, go up to more abstractions, go up to more generalities very slowly and dwell upon them before reaching those and committing to any of those very abstract and general conclusions. For I do not endeavor, remember we have to keep in mind what we are trying to do here. I do not endeavor either by triumphs of confutation or pleadings of antiquity or assumption of authority or even by the veil of obscurity to invest these inventions of mine with any majesty. So we do know it's an occupational hazard of intellectuals and philosophers included among the intellectuals, that they like argument for the sake of argument. They like beating other people in debates, right? Or they like to show how well read they are by being able to quote antique sources on just about everything that's going on. Or they like to be in the position of being, I'm the authority and I know more than everybody else around me, and so I'm looking for a certain kind of social status. That is not what we are about. It's not about argumentation. It's not about showing how smart you are. It's not about gaining social status. Right? That's not where the majesty of our accomplishments, my accomplishments, your accomplishments is going to come from. We're interested in truth. What are the facts of nature? What can we actually learn? I lead them to things themselves. That is to say, other people who read my books, anybody who perhaps is one of my students. I'm not going to say, I'm the professor, believe me, and so forth. I will lead them to the facts, to the things themselves, and the concordances of things, that they may see for themselves what they have, what they can dispute, what they can add and contribute to the common stock. So it's not only myself that I'm not going to just be credulous, believe anything the ancients have had to say. I am going to think for myself when I, in turn, become a teacher of mankind or a teacher of boys, teacher of students. I'm going to teach them to think for themselves, how to investigate nature for themselves. And for myself, if in anything I have been either too credulous or too little awake and attentive, that is to say, if I make mistakes, I'm fine with acknowledging that maybe I will have made, that I have made mistakes, that I will make mistakes. I'm fine with being called upon that. So I so present these things naked and open that my errors can be marked and set aside before the mass of knowledge be further infected by them. I don't want to make mistakes. I may make mistakes, but don't just take whatever I say as I'm the authority and you have to believe this. Rather, feel welcome to criticize me, to challenge me, to point out my errors. Our goal then is a common one of getting things right. I suppose that I have established forever a true and lawful marriage between the empirical and the rational faculty, the unkind and ill-starred divorce and separation of which has thrown into confusion all the affairs of the human family. Now, this is an important passage here because already in the early modern era, what we now call the distinction between empiricism and rationalism, and sometimes the divorce between the empiricists and the rationalists, how they are completely opposed to each other. That divorce, Bacon is signaling right off the bat, is a mistake. Whatever it is that we have done that has led us to think that what we learn from observation and what we can learn from abstract reasoning are different faculties, different sources of knowledge that are not compatible with each other. That is problematic. That itself needs to be rethought. Whatever we mean by the empirical, that is to say, based on observation of the facts by means of our senses, whatever we mean by the rational, abstract, conceptual, logical, mathematical reasoning, those should be an integrated function of the human mind. And Bacon's epistemology then is based on trying to establish that and thinking that he has, in fact, established that. All right, carrying on, what is our subject matter? An interesting mark about religion, and kind of an indirect point about religion, and the fact that so far Bacon has emphasized nature so much. Is he implicitly or explicitly going to devalue God, the gods, religion, the supernatural, and so forth? So, my first admonition, which is also my prayer, is that men confine the sense within the limits of duty in respect of things divine. For the sense is like the sun, which reveals the face of earth, but seals and shuts up the face of heaven. So we're not going to too quickly try to get up to the heavens, so to speak. It's like looking directly into the sun, right, or things that are too bright. We of course are going to be interested in investigating the sun, just as of course we're going to be interested in the heavens, but we're going to need to get there indirectly, and we're first going to start with what the sun illuminates, or what is going on in this natural world. So we are going to start with the senses. We are going to start with the senses observing nature and reason carefully to wherever that leads us. My next admonition, that is to say, that in flying from this evil, they fall not into the opposite error, which they will surely do if they think that the inquisition of nature is in any part interdicted or forbidden. Right? So there has been, of course, in philosophy, and particularly in theological philosophies, a kind of dualistic view that exalts the supernatural and devalues the natural, to the point of arguing in some cases that the natural is not worthy of our attentions. Not only is it not worthy of our attentions, but that it is a sin to try to be too curious and to think that doing science systematically is a good thing to do. Here thinking perhaps of St. Augustine in the late 300s and early 400s. Study of nature is fine, it's good, it's valuable, it is at the minimum not forbidden. Again, a characteristically modern point in Francis Bacon. Lastly, I would stress one general admonition to all, that they consider what are the true ends of knowledge. Keep always in mind the value proposition about philosophy and science. Interesting also that Bacon is integrating values into science and philosophy. Another dichotomy that often plagues philosophy is a distinction between facts and values, and characterizing that distinction in such a way that you think that they are opposite to each other or to be kept entirely separate from each other. For Bacon, science and philosophy is a valuable enterprise and a value-laden enterprise, and we should always keep those values in important. But what are the important values? What is the true end of knowledge? We seek knowledge not either for the pleasure of the mind. It is a pleasure of the mind, but it's not that we're just engaging in mental stimulation for the sake of enjoying mental stimulation. Or for contention, that is to say, we're not doing it because we just like to argue with people about stuff. We do like to argue with people about stuff, but that's not the point. The argument is not an end in itself. Or for superiority to others, or for profit, or fame, or power, or any of these inferior things. But here's the true value of pursuing knowledge: for the benefit and use of life. For the benefit of life, for the use of life. We are living creatures living in this natural world. Knowledge is for the purpose of applying it to our lives in a way that makes them better for their benefit. Okay, so now, with all of those prefatory remarks, Bacon has a great ambition for a 6-part uber book, or big book. And what we're next going to do is turn just to his quick summary, a couple of remarks there, and then a few remarks from the new organon. So the Great Instauration has this 6-part breakdown, division of the sciences, the new organon, and so forth. And then let's go into the summary. Coming back to that metaphor of seamanship and sailing, right? Having thus coasted past the ancient arts, so we've excerpted where Bacon has gone through some of the great achievements of intellectual history. So we've coasted past the ancient arts. The next point is to equip the intellect for passing beyond. We now want to go further into the new, into the unknown, and to discover new things. And here we have the signal of the logic that we are necessarily going to try to develop. The art which I introduce with this view is a kind of logic, although the difference between it and the ordinary logic is great. And what are these differences? Bacon goes on to say there are 3. Mine differs from it in 3 points especially, viz., or namely, the end aimed at, in the order of demonstration, and in the starting point of the inquiry. Now let's then go on to break each of these down. What is the end? What is the goal? What is the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? For the end which this science of mine proposes, that is to say, this new logic, is the invention not of arguments, but of arts. It's not argument for disputatio, right, to borrow a Latin phrase, for the point of disputing. Right? It is for invention. We want a logic that is going to help us invent new knowledge and invent, by implication, new instruments. The effect of one being to overcome an opponent. Sorry, let me start that sentence again. The effect of one, that is to say, the old logic, being to overcome an opponent in argument, of the other to command nature in action. So the assumption of one kind of logic is a kind of dialectical argumentation, where I advance a thesis, you advance a thesis, we get into an argument, and we use the logic to try to refute each other, and then see what kind of resolution we can reach. Who wins the argument here? Rather than it being this social argument thing, it is my mind in connection to nature. I want to be able to understand nature and then command nature. It's not primarily a social thing at all. So that's a very different end. For in the ordinary logic, almost all the work is spent about the syllogism. Now here, a syllogism is another name primarily for deductive logic. And there can be categorical syllogisms, disjunctive syllogisms, hypothetical syllogisms, depending on the nature of the primary proposition that launches the argument. And the way it will go is, in a deductive categorical syllogism, I will start with a big general categorical statement about categories. Say all humans are mortal. And then I will apply that to a particular individual. Socrates is a human. Therefore, it follows logically that Socrates is a mortal. And so we figure out all of the possible syllogistic forms. We memorize which ones are valid, which ones are invalid. And then we go on and think of ourselves as well-trained logically. But notice what we do with that is that we're starting with a very general premise. All humans are mortal. Where did that come from? Well, we don't ask really too much about it. We just take that premise and we see what follows from it deductively. Now, what Bacon is wanting to emphasize is induction. That is to say, going from the particular, going from the unique individual observations up to the generalizations. We might ask the questions, well, how did I come to know or believe that all humans are mortal? That's a very big generalization. It must be based on a lot of observations. Have I done enough observations, the right kind of observations? Have I done the experiments in order to be able to induce my way up to? That's where the real action is. Of induction, the logicians seem hardly to have taken any serious thought, but they pass it by with a slight notice. I, on the contrary, reject demonstration by syllogism as acting too confusingly and letting nature slip out of its hand. If you start with these very general abstract principles too quickly, you're starting distant from nature, and you're just going to get into confusions, and all sorts of nonsense can slip into your very general principles. Now, if the very notions of the mind be improperly and over hastily abstracted from facts, vague and not sufficiently definite, faulty, in short, in many ways, the whole edifice tumbles. And that's been a great failing, Bacon is arguing, about much of traditional philosophy and much of traditional science. By contrast, yet in dealing with the nature of things, I use induction throughout. Hence, it follows that the order of demonstration is likewise inverted. For hitherto, that is to say up to now, the proceeding has been to fly at once from the sense and particulars up to the most general proposition as certain fixed poles for the argument to turn upon, and from these to derive the rest by middle terms. So I might go to, well, all material things are extended in space, right? And so I've got a concept of space, a concept of extension, I've got a concept of material things. I'm just going to consider them in general, and then I put together this abstract formulation, and I'm going to then see what can I deduce from that very general formulation and come up with a physics, say, based on that. That's the wrong way of going about it. My plan is to proceed regularly and gradually from one axiom to another so that the most general are not reached till the last. So we're going to take a long time before we ever get up to all material things are extended in space. Right? There's going to be a huge amount of science that we'll need to do, and a logic that enables us to do that science before we're going cautiously to accept such a very general premise. But the greatest challenge I introduce is in the form itself of induction and the judgment made thereby. For the induction of which the logicians speak, which proceeds by simple enumeration, is a puerile thing, concludes at hazard, is always liable to be upset by a contradictory instance, takes into account only what is known and ordinary, and leads to no result. Very often in the history of philosophy, particularly more casual history of philosophy, Bacon is cited as an empiricist, but then as a kind of naive empiricist, or as an inductivist, but then as a rather naive inductivist. It's just a matter of observing a number of examples over and over again and then coming up with a generalization. Bacon is very clear to say this is not going to be a naive inductive empiricism. It's going to be hopefully a sophisticated one. And what he means by that is what the sciences stand to, in need of rather, is a form of induction which shall analyze experience and take it to pieces, and by a process of exclusion and rejection lead to an inevitable conclusion. So what we are then going to do, whatever we are studying, right, we are going to analyze it, not just a simple observation. We look at it from every possible analytical viewpoint that we can come up with. When we are doing our experiments, we are going to take the thing apart and put it back together in as many ways as possible. And we'll take it apart systematically, we'll put it back together systematically, we'll keep careful notes. All of this very sophisticated experimental method is what Bacon is envisioning. That's going to be the logic that we are trying to develop. Nor is this all. For I sink the foundations of the sciences deeper and firmer, and I begin the inquiry nearer the source than men have done heretofore, submitting to examination those things which the common logic takes on trust. Don't take anything on trust. One of the things he then goes on to criticize the logicians for doing, the philosophers for doing, saying is, well, we're going to do the logic of astronomy, or we're going to do the logic of chemistry, or whatever it is, and we will talk to the astronomers and the chemists, and they will tell us what their axioms are. And we will just see ourselves as handmaidens to help them, whatever their axioms and principles are, how to develop those further and perhaps more systematically. Bacon is arguing that what we need to do is whatever those axioms are that they are taking for granted, we need to subject those to analysis and ask what are the facts of nature, the observational things and the experiments that have led to those axioms being accepted. All right. Next. Lastly, the information of the sense itself. I'm an empiricist, but again, not a naive empiricist. The information of the sense itself, I sift and examine in many ways. For certain as it is that the senses deceive, but then at the same time they supply the means of discovering their own errors. So it's not simply that we're going to take the senses and whatever is presented by our senses as just automatically true and simply acceptable. Bacon does believe that the senses do put us in contact with reality, but sometimes it's not entirely accurate, or where contact is in a somewhat deceptive form. So even any sensory observation, any initial perception, we're going to be critical about that. And if it's a matter of looking at, somebody looking at the thing from different angles, paying careful attention to the conditions around me, paying careful attention to my conditions, and being experimental before reaching any conclusion about the status even of any given perceptual observation, rather. So, to meet these difficulties, I have sought on all sides diligently and faithfully to provide helps for the sense, substitutes to supply its failures, rectifications to correct its errors, and this I endeavor to accomplish not so much by instruments as by experiments. So yes, microscopes and telescopes. Actually, microscopes are going to be more in the future, but there are magnifying glasses that are available. All of the various instruments, holding a horn up to our ears to augment the sounds that are coming in. Yes, all of these instruments are fine, but a lot of experiments, even with respect to sensory observations that are coming in. Now, those come in and then they impress themselves upon our mind, and this is the empiricist commitment. Bacon does offer a kind of tabula rasa theory, blank slate kind of theory, but again, is not a naive blank slate theory. Notice what he says about the human intellect. They would be sufficient of themselves if the human intellect were even and like a fair sheet of paper with no writing on it. So a blank sheet of paper or a fair sheet of paper that's nice and smooth. But since the minds of men are strangely possessed and beset, so that there is no true and even surface left to reflect the genuine rays of things, it is necessary to seek a remedy for this also. So our senses and our intellects, both of them need to be treated critically by developing instruments and experiments before admitting and believing anything there. Now, Bacon calls these idols. Now, the idols or phantoms by which the mind is occupied are either adventitious or innate. So that is to say, by adventitious, he means things that come from other people, things that we read in other scientists or philosophers or from our parents or from our teachers. So they come from outside and they enter into our minds in various ways, and they can be aids, but they also can be obstacles to our coming to know the truth. But there also are innate obstacles or innate idols, innate obstacle or problems that we have to be aware of in our own minds, the furniture of the mind, so to speak, and not to be naive about that. So we might either get them from the doctrines or sects of philosophers, but the innate are inherent in the very nature of the intellect. So we need to be learning how to be critical about what we are hearing from other people, but we also need to be self-critical about the operations of our own minds. Now, both of these are difficult, and as the first two kinds of idols are hard to eradicate, so idols of this last kind cannot be eradicated at all. That is to say, it's hard to get past false teachings that have come down to us, but we can do so with work. But the very furniture of our mind, using that metaphor, that's as part of our mind. We can't get rid of that. We have to work with it and or around it in a self-critical fashion. All that can be done is to point them out so that this insidious action of the mind may be marked and reproved, and to lay it down once and for all as fixed and established maxim that the intellect is not qualified to judge except by means of induction. Now, what do we mean by these idols? Bacon famously enumerates 4 of them. Let me mention a couple of them in passing. One is an adventitious one, the idol of the marketplace. We spend a lot of time socially, and to the extent that we are somewhat passive-minded, almost by osmosis, we just pick up things from our parents, from our siblings, from our friends, from our teachers, and so forth, and we find ourselves believing them without even really meaning to believe them in the first place. They just become part of our minds. But what we need to do then is systematically, as serious thinkers, be self-critical about every such candidate we find ourselves entertaining and wanting to make a part of our science. That's very hard to do. But also there are innate ones that, for example, when I come up with an idea all by myself, or I make an observation all by myself, and I see various things and I come up with a hypothesis or an explanation and it seems reasonable to me. It seems to be part of the nature of the mind that I want to believe it. It may be a kind of easy pride. I thought of this all by myself. And we more credulously then will stick with things that we think we came up with all by ourselves, and we will have a tendency not to be as self-critical of our own ideas as we should be. So we have to be aware. Now, we're not going to change that psychological disposition, but we have to be aware of it and develop instruments and tools to work around that, just to make sure that we are not doing that. Those, however, who aspire not to guess and divine, but to discover and know. Do you really want to discover new things? Do you really want to know? Who propose not to devise mimic and fabulous worlds of their own, but to examine and dissect the nature of this very world itself, must go to the facts themselves for everything. Right? Make that part of your methodological or logical commitment to how you're going to use your mind. Nor can the place of this hard labor and search and worldwide survey, we're going to have generalizations about the world. We have to survey the entire world. That's going to be a lot of observation, a lot of experimenting. Be supplied by any genius or meditation or argumentation. Doesn't matter how smart, how good you are at meditation, how good you are at argumentation. You have to do the hard work. No, not if all men's wits could be meet in one. So we have to do a lot of hard work, and each step of doing that hard work has its pitfalls, has its dangers. For first, the information of the sense itself, sometimes failing, sometimes false. Observation, careless, irregular, and led by chance. Tradition, vain and fed on rumor. Practice, or habits, slavishly bent upon its work. Experiment, blind, stupid, vague, and prematurely broken off. And lastly, natural history, trivial and poor. All of these have contributed to supply the understanding with very bad materials for philosophy and the sciences. Now, we do need to use our senses to observe, to appeal to and learn from the best of tradition, to have certain practical habits, to do lots of experiments, to rely on natural history. But all of these things can be done badly and with careful attention and sophistication done well. It is hard work and long in generating the fruits, so to speak. The only hope, therefore, of any greater increase or progress lies in a reconstruction of the sciences. All right, I want to jump to an important line about the nature of this experimental method again, and to re-emphasize this point about the empiricism and the experimental inductive methods not being naive in any form. What Bacon has in mind is a very hands-on, analytical, breaking things apart and putting them back together scientific method. What he's interested in is, I mean it to be a history not only of nature free and large, but much more of a nature under constraint and vexed. That is to say, when by art and the hand of man she is forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded. We're going to, so to speak, make nature reveal her secrets by these very sophisticated experimental methods. And along the way, we're not going to be too quick to formulate our judgments. Nevertheless, I wish to be understood in the meantime that they are conclusions by which I do not at all mean to bind myself. I have hypotheses, I have theories, I have working models that I'm going to develop along the way. All of those I'm going to hold tentatively while I'm doing this long and hard scientific work. Nor need anyone be alarmed at such suspension of judgment. It will take as much work and as much time as it takes. I have made a beginning of the work. A beginning, as I hope, not unimportant, but nonetheless, this is just a beginning. And it's going to be up to the rest of us, or perhaps many generations, to carry on this work significantly. Man is but the servant and interpreter of nature. What he does and what he knows is only what he has observed of nature's order. For the chain of causes cannot by any force be loosed or broken, nor can nature be commanded except by being obeyed. So here a fundamental commitment of objectivity. Objects are what they are. Nature is what it is. We are servants, right? Our minds are servants, so to speak, of nature. That is to say, we follow along when we are observing and interpreting nature. Now, we will then, of course, have a commanding role when we apply our knowledge and modify nature, but it's going to be on terms set by nature itself. And so those twin objects, human knowledge and human power, do really meet in one. Knowledge is to augment human power. Human knowledge, human power, it's not a divergence of one from the other. And an admonition to avoid subjectivism, as we call it. We're not just as subjects freely disconnected from nature to imagine whatever we are, just to believe whatever it is that we make up or that we want by means of our passions and emotions to believe is true. All depends on keeping the eye steadily fixed upon the facts of nature, and so receiving their images simply as they are. For God forbid that we should give out a dream of our own imagination for a pattern of the world. All right, just to close with a couple of excerpts from Novum Organum, much of which is much more aphoristic. And these are the ones that are often quoted from Francis Bacon. Man being the servant and interpreter of nature. And the emphasis again here is on nature. We're starting with nature, not the supernatural, and we are the servant of nature when we are doing our science. Neither the naked hand nor the understanding left to itself can effect much. It is by instruments and helps that the work is done, which are as much wanted for the understanding as for the hand. We can do a lot with our hands, but hands with well-developed tools, skillfully used, it's amazing how much we can do. The same thing with the mind. The mind left to itself can't get much done. But develop this philosophical method, this scientific method, this new logic that Bacon has in mind. It's amazing, and it will be amazing what the mind can do. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Okay. Another famous aphorism. And then finally, an emphasis on the new. We are all about new works, new sciences. The world is open-ended to our minds, to our power. At the early stages of the modern world, Bacon is optimistically seeing an open-ended future for us to explore and create.